Celia Sutton had been told so many things about herself over the course of her 24 years that she had long since learned to separate the truths from the small cruelties people wrapped in the language of good advice. And the morning she arrived in Dusty Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the spring of 1882, she carried every one of those words like stones sewn into the lining of her traveling coat. The stagecoach rattled to a stop on the main street of what could only generously be called a town. Celia pressed her gloved fingers to the window glass and looked out at the wide, sun-hammered dirt road, at the two-story general store with its crooked sign, at the saloon already open and already busy at 10 in the morning, at the little white church that sat at the far end of the street like a hopeful afterthought. She drew a slow breath and told herself this was what beginning again looked like. It was not beautiful, but it was real. She climbed down from the coach without waiting for the driver's hand, which made the older woman seated across from her click her tongue in a way Celia had grown very familiar with over the last 2 days of travel. "You could stand to let a man help you," the woman had said somewhere outside of Laramie, studying Celia over her knitting needles with the particular expression of someone who believed they were offering a gift. "A woman who does everything herself gives a man nothing to feel useful about, especially out here." Celia had smiled then the way she had learned to smile at such remarks, which was to say she had arranged her mouth into a pleasant shape and offered no words in return. She was good at that. She had been practicing since she was 16, and her father's sister had sat her down after Sunday supper to explain that her opinions were sharper than was becoming, that her laugh was too loud for a parlor, and that her habit of reading anything she could get her hands on gave her ideas that would never serve her well once she had a husband and children to attend to. Her mother had not disagreed. Celia had disagreed, but quietly, always quietly, and she had gone on reading. She had gone on forming opinions. She had gone on laughing too loudly, according to everyone who had a preference about the matter, and then she had come west. The decision had not been impulsive, though she was certain everyone who knew her back in Philadelphia would describe it that way. She had planned it with the same careful attention she gave to anything she took seriously. She had answered an advertisement placed in the Wyoming Territorial Gazette by a rancher named Eldon Marsh, who was seeking a schoolteacher for a settlement school he intended to build on his property, which sat 6 miles outside of Dusty Creek. The advertisement had promised a private room, a fair wage, and the opportunity to build something meaningful in a place that needed it. Celia had written him a letter that was direct and specific about her qualifications. He had written back. They had exchanged 4 letters total, and by the end of that correspondence she had packed 2 trunks and booked her passage west. She was a schoolteacher. She had a position. She had purpose. She was not, despite what her mother had tearfully suggested at the train station, running away from anything. She was running towards something which was entirely different, and she understood the difference even if no one else did. She collected her 2 trunks from the top of the coach, directed the driver on their placement on the boardwalk with a firmness that made him blink, and then stood on the sun-warm planks of Dusty Creek's Main Street and looked around for whoever was supposed to meet her. The person who appeared was not Eldon Marsh. It was a boy of perhaps 14 with a gap-toothed grin and a hat that was too large for his head, who introduced himself as Petey and said that Mr. Marsh had sent him to bring Miss Sutton out to the ranch in the wagon. He said it with the cheerful ease of a boy who had been given a simple task and found nothing complicated about the world, and Celia liked him immediately. "These are my trunks," she told him, gesturing. Petey looked at them. "Both of them. Both of them." "Yes, ma'am." She climbed up onto the wagon seat beside him without waiting, and they set off down the road that wound out of town and into the wide open grassland that stretched toward the mountains in the west, and Celia let herself feel, for the first time since she had boarded the train in Philadelphia, something close to wonder. The land here was immense, in a way that the word immense did not properly cover. It went on past the edge of what the eye could make sense of, golden and green and interrupted only by rock formations that jutted up like the remains of something ancient and unbothered. The sky was the deepest blue she had ever seen, so deeply blue it almost had weight to it, and the light was different here, cleaner, more direct, as if the sun in Wyoming had not yet learned to be filtered by anything. "It is something," she said, mostly to herself. "Yes, ma'am," said Petey. "Gets less interesting after a while." "I doubt that very much," said Celia. Petey shrugged with the philosophical indifference of a boy who had grown up somewhere and therefore could not see it. Celia looked at the mountains and thought about the classroom she was going to build, and the students she was going to teach, and the life she was going to make here in this enormous, serious, beautiful place, and she felt, tentatively, something like hope. Eldon Marsh was 61 years old, deeply tanned, and possessed of the particular manner of a man who had spent so many decades being the largest presence in any room he entered that he had come to believe it was a natural law. He met her at the gate of his property with two of his ranch hands flanking him and a look of assessment on his face that Celia recognized as the kind men gave women when they were deciding how much of a problem she was going to be. She met his gaze directly, which she could tell was already one strike against her. "Miss Sutton," he said, "you are younger than I expected." "I am 24, she said. "My letters stated as much." "They did," he allowed. "You have your teaching certificate." "In my trunk," she said, along with 3 letters of recommendation from the headmaster of the Briar Academy in Philadelphia, where I taught for 2 years, and a personal letter from Dr. Harrison Wells, who chairs the Pennsylvania Board of Education and has been kind enough to call my classroom methods innovative. Eldon Marsh's expression shifted in the way of a man reassessing a situation. He nodded once. "Good," he said. "The building is not quite finished. Another 2 weeks, I am told. In the meantime you will take your meals with the household and have use of the east room." "That is acceptable," Celia said. She was shown to the east room by a stout, warm-faced woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who served as the ranch's housekeeper and cook, and who looked at Celia with an expression of such immediately maternal appraisal that Celia almost laughed. Mrs. Aldridge was the sort of woman who decided how she felt about a person in the first 30 seconds of meeting them, and then never changed her mind. And apparently she had decided in Celia's favor, because she patted her hand, and said the room got good light in the mornings, and she would bring extra blankets because the nights were still cold. "Mr. Marsh is not a bad man," Mrs. Aldridge said, which was exactly the kind of thing that was said about men who were considerably more complicated than good or bad. "He just likes order." "I understand order," Celia said. "I imagine you do," said Mrs. Aldridge with a small smile. "I imagine you also have your own ideas about what it ought to look like." Celia looked at her. "Is that a problem?" "Out here." Mrs. Aldridge straightened the blanket on the bed and smoothed a wrinkle from the quilt with one practiced hand. "Depends entirely on who you encounter." The ranch was called the Double M, and it ran cattle across 4,000 acres of grassland that Eldon Marsh had built up over 30 years from a single section of homestead claim into something that genuinely warranted the word empire, if a modest one. He employed a dozen hands, a foreman, a cook for the bunkhouse, and had recently added a second barn for the horses he was starting to breed with serious intent. The operation had the feel of a place that ran on strict rhythm and expected everyone within it to learn the beat quickly. Celia spent her first 3 days walking the property in the mornings before the heat settled in, learning the land, noting where things were, mapping the distances in her head the way she mapped everything. She was systematic by nature, which was one of the things that had made her an excellent teacher, and also one of the things that had most thoroughly convinced her family that she would never settle gracefully into domestic life. Her mother had once told her, not unkindly but not gently either, that a woman who organized everything like a military campaign made men feel managed rather than loved. Celia had thought about that for a long time, actually, because her mother was not entirely wrong that she organized everything like a military campaign. What she had disagreed with was the conclusion that this was a flaw. She thought of it as competence. She thought of it as the reasonable application of intelligence to the business of living. She could not understand why this was considered charming in a man and alarming in a woman, and the fact that she could not understand it and said so out loud was, apparently, proof of exactly the problem everyone kept describing. She was thinking about this on the fourth morning of her time at the Double M, standing at the fence line that separated the main yard from the south pasture, watching two of the ranch hands attempt to calm a horse that had gotten itself worked into a genuine fury about something, when a voice behind her said, "That horse has been angry since Tuesday and nobody has figured out why yet." She turned. The man standing a few feet away was not one of the hands she had already catalogued. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the particular kind of stillness about him that belonged to people who had spent years in wide open spaces and learned that most of what happened out there did not require immediate reaction. He had dark hair under a battered hat, a jaw that had not met a razor in at least 3 days, and eyes that were the dark gold brown of creek water in autumn. He was wearing working clothes, dusty from what looked like a full day of genuine use, and he was looking at the agitated horse in the pasture with a calm, considered expression that suggested he was actually thinking about it. Could be the cinch was fitted too tightly, and somebody did not notice, Celia said, because she had been watching the horse for several minutes and this was her best theory. The man looked at her. There was a pause in which he seemed to be reconsidering something. "That is possible," he said. He looked back at the horse. "Could also be a snake smell. They pick that up and it stays with them." "Does he seem afraid or angry?" Celia asked. "Angry," the man said. "Fear looks different. The ears go back differently." "Then probably not a snake smell," she said. "More likely something done to him than something he sensed." Another pause. "You know horses?" "Not particularly," she said, "but I pay attention." He looked at her again with those autumn water eyes, and she had the distinct impression of being read, not assessed the way Eldon Marsh had assessed her, which had been about deciding whether she was going to be inconvenient, but genuinely read, the way one reads something that has turned out to be more interesting than the cover suggested. "Monroe Ford," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it without hesitation. "Celia Sutton." "The schoolteacher," he said. "Is that how I am being referred to?" "It is how you were introduced. Mr. Marsh mentioned it at supper." He tucked his thumbs into his belt and looked back at the horse, which had settled slightly. "He mentioned you were from Philadelphia." He mentioned it in a way that made it sound like a liability, she guessed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "He mentioned it in a way that suggested he was reserving judgment," Monroe Ford said diplomatically. "That is a kind interpretation," Celia said. She looked back at the horse. The two hands were still working with it, speaking low, and she could see one of them checking the cinch now. "Are you one of Mr. Marsh's hands?" "I am the foreman," he said. She looked at him again. He said it without any particular emphasis, which she appreciated. Men in positions of authority often announced themselves with a flourish, as if the title were a separate entity they were proud to be carrying around with them. He said it like a fact, the way one might say, "The sky is blue," or "It is a warm morning." "Then you are responsible for that horse's discomfort," she said pleasantly. His mouth did the not-quite-smile thing again. "In a broad sense," he allowed. "I will have someone look at the tack more carefully." "I think that would help," she said. She turned and walked back toward the house, and she did not look back, but she was aware of the particular quality of a gaze that follows a person with genuine attention rather than casual observation, and she thought about it more than she intended to for the rest of that morning. Monroe Ford, she learned over the following days, was 28 years old. He had been raised in Texas, had driven cattle north on the Kisham Trail twice before he was 22, had worked ranches in Kansas and Colorado before landing at the Double M 4 years ago, and becoming the kind of foreman that a man like Eldon Marsh relied on without quite admitting how much he relied on. He had a bunkhouse room that was separate from the main hand's quarters, a horse that was his own and not the ranch's, and a reputation among the men for being firm and fair and not given to unnecessary words. Celia learned these things not from Monroe himself but from Petey, who was a natural source of information about everyone on the property, and shared it with the generous openness of a boy who had not yet learned that people sometimes preferred to offer their own stories. She also learned from Mrs. Aldridge that Monroe Ford had never been married, that he ate his supper with the Maine household about twice a week at Mr. Marsh's invitation, and that he was, in Mrs. Aldridge's carefully neutral phrasing, a man of considerable good character who had never given anyone cause to say otherwise. The schoolhouse was finished on the 16th day of May. It was a single room, well built, with 4 windows and a proper door and a small blackboard that had been ordered from Laramie and arrived only slightly cracked. Celia spent 2 full days arranging it to her satisfaction, which was the kind of work that absorbed her completely, and she was standing on a chair hanging the map of the United States territories when the door opened and Monroe Ford came in. "The chair leg on the left is cracked," he said immediately. She looked down. It was, in fact, cracked. She had noticed and made a calculation that it would hold. "I see that," she said. "You are standing on it. I am aware of that as well." He was quiet for a moment. "How long until you are done with what you are doing?" "Perhaps 2 minutes." "I will wait," he said, and leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his eyes on the cracked chair leg in the alert manner of a man who had decided that the 2 minutes were going to feel very long to him. She finished hanging the map, which she had bought with her own money in Philadelphia and rolled carefully for the journey west, smoothed the edges against the wall, and stepped down from the chair without incident. Monroe Ford exhaled. "You were worried," she said. "The chair was cracked," he said, as if this explained everything, which perhaps it did. "I appreciate the concern," she said, and she meant it without irony, which was not something she was always able to manage when people implied she needed more care than she was capable of giving herself. There was a difference, she had come to understand, between people who worried because they thought you were incapable, and people who worried because they had noticed a specific and legitimate danger and responded to it honestly. Monroe Ford was clearly in the second category. He came into the room and looked at the map, at the small desk she had positioned at the front, at the chalk she had set in the tray below the blackboard, at the primer books she had stacked on the shelf she had asked 2 of the hands to build for her along the east wall. "It looks like a real school," he said. "It is a real school," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is." He had come, it turned out, to tell her that she would have 9 students when she opened, ranging in age from 6 to 13, representing 7 families from the surrounding homesteads and one of the ranch families on the Double M itself. He had been the one, Mrs. Aldridge later told her, who had ridden to each of those families to let them know a real teacher had come, and who had persuaded 2 of the more reluctant fathers that sending their children to school was worth the half-day of lost work it would cost them. Celia did not know how to respond to that when she found out, so she went and found Monroe at the fence line where she had first spoken to him and said, "Mrs. Aldridge told me you rode to the families." He looked at her steadily. "Someone had to." "Why you?" He considered this. "Because I thought it mattered," he said, "and because I believed you would be good at it." She looked at him for a moment. "You had known me for less than a week at that point." "I know," he said, "but you pay attention. That is most of what good teaching is, I think." She did not say anything for a moment because she was managing the unexpected effect his words were having on her, which was something she was not used to managing. She was not, generally speaking, a woman who was easily moved by compliments. She had received them in her life in the 2 main varieties they tended to come in, those that were about her appearance, which she received with polite acknowledgment and privately found irrelevant, and those that were about her competence, which she received with genuine gratitude because they engaged something real. But Monroe Ford's words were something slightly different from either category. He had not said she was good. He had said he believed she would be good. And he had acted on that belief before it was confirmed, which was an act of faith rather than observation. And faith was something she found considerably harder to receive without feeling it. "Thank you," she said, and she said it simply and meant it completely. He nodded once in the way of a man who received genuine thanks without knowing quite what to do with it. "Your school opens Monday," he said. "The Harmon children will need a ride in the wagon. I will arrange it." "That is not your responsibility," she said. "I know," he said. "I will arrange it." She almost smiled. "All right," she said. The school opened on a Monday that was bright and cool, with a smell of new grass coming off the prairie that Celia drew into her lungs like something she had been waiting her whole life to breathe. 9 children arrived, ranging from a girl of 6 named Clara who held her older brother's hand very tightly and looked at the blackboard as if it might bite her, to a boy of 13 named Thomas Harmon, who arrived with the particular expression of a boy who has decided in advance that he is not going to find anything interesting and is daring the world to prove him wrong. Celia had dealt with Thomas Harmon's type before. She opened the school day by writing a mathematics problem on the board that was genuinely hard, too hard for most of the younger children, and waited. Thomas looked at it, looked away, looked at it again. She could see the machinery of his mind engaging despite his best intentions. By the end of the first hour, he had solved 2 variations of the problem, and was looking at her with a complicated expression that contained within it the beginnings of respect. She taught them for 4 hours, and sent them home, and stood in the empty schoolroom afterward with her hands on the back of the desk chair, and felt something so full and warm and right that she had to take 3 careful breaths to keep it contained. Monroe came by at the end of the day. He stopped at the doorway and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," he said. "Thomas Harmon is going to give me trouble," she said, "but the interesting kind." Clara Betts cried for the first 20 minutes and then stopped and drew the most extraordinary picture of a horse I have ever seen a 6-year-old produce. James Aldridge, Mrs. Aldridge's grandson. Yes. He cannot sit still for more than 6 minutes by my count, which means I am going to need to restructure the lesson plan to give him something physical to do every hour. And the Ray's girls have been speaking primarily Spanish at home, which their father did not mention, and which is going to require me to adjust my reading approach for them. Monroe was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not quite the not quite smile. It was something quieter and more serious, and it made the air in the room feel slightly different. "You noticed all of that," he said. "In 4 hours," she said, "which is not difficult. They are children. They show you everything." "Most people do not see it," he said. "Most people are not looking," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Aldridge is keeping supper warm. She said to tell you not to be late." "I will not be late," she said. She was 5 minutes late because she stopped to write the next day's lesson plan. And when she arrived in the kitchen, Mrs. Aldridge pressed a hot plate into her hands without comment, and Monroe was already seated, and did not say anything about the 5 minutes, but handed her the bread without being asked. And she thought that he had probably known she would be 5 minutes late and had made his peace with it. And there was something about that which settled into her chest like a warm stone and stayed there. The weeks that followed had the quality of something assembling itself. The school became real and steady, and the children became known to her, which was the part of teaching she had always loved most, the slow revealing of who a person was when they were given the space and the tools to show you. Thomas Harmon was brilliant and frustrated by it, which was a combination she recognized deeply and handled with the patience she wished someone had extended to her at 13. Clara Betts turned out to have a memory so extraordinary that Celia had to work to keep the material novel enough to stay ahead of it. The Ray's girls, Maria and Sophiana, were sharp and quick, and once she found the right approach to the reading, they came forward with an eagerness that made her heart do something complicated. She began to learn Dusty Creek itself, riding into town with Mrs. Aldridge on Saturdays for supplies, slowly accumulating the map of a small place, its rhythms and its personalities and its particular flavor of frontier life. Dusty Creek in 1882 was a town of about 200 souls, growing steadily as more homesteaders claimed the surrounding land, with all the tensions and hopes that attended such growth. There were the established ranching families like Marsh, who had been there long enough to feel ownership over the character of the place. There were the new homesteaders, many of them recently arrived from the East or from Europe, who were trying to make something out of land that was harder and wilder than they had been led to believe. There was the small community of Mexican families who had been working the territory for generations and occupied an uncomfortable position between the welcome and the not quite welcome. There were the Shoshone people whose land this had been, and whose presence on the outskirts of the territory was a constant reminder of the injustice that sat at the foundation of all this frontier enterprise, an injustice that most people in Dusty Creek acknowledged only by not speaking of it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Celia noticed these things because she noticed things. She wrote about them in the journal she kept with the same careful attention she had been keeping journals since she was 12, not because she intended to publish them, but because writing was how she understood the world, and this world was worth understanding. She had been at the Double M for 6 weeks when the event occurred that she would later identify as the moment when everything shifted, or perhaps more accurately, the moment when she understood what had been shifting all along. It was a Saturday, and she had driven herself to town in the small buggy Mr. Marsh permitted her use of on weekends, a gesture of accommodation that she suspected Monroe had arranged. She had her list of school supplies and her own modest shopping, and she had planned to stop at the small lending library that Mrs. Hargrove ran out of the back room of the dry goods store, which held perhaps 40 books and operated on the honor system, and was one of Celia's favorite discoveries about Dusty Creek. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch tucked under her arm when she nearly walked into Gerald Marsh, Eldon Marsh's eldest son, who was standing on the boardwalk with 2 of his friends, in the way that young men with money and time sometimes stand in places, as if they own the weather. Gerald Marsh was 30 years old and had his father's size without his father's patience, and he had been looking at Celia since her arrival with an interest she found unwelcome and had been managing at a careful distance. "Miss Sutton," he said, with the particular smile of a man who is accustomed to his smile being received well. "All alone on a Saturday." "Apparently," she said pleasantly, and moved to step around him. "I thought a woman of your learning might appreciate some company," he said, which was the kind of thing said by men who believed that the offer of their company was by definition a gift. "Allow me to buy you a coffee at Mrs. Prentice's." "Thank you," she said, "but I have what I need today." "A woman ought not to be too independent," Gerald Marsh said, and he said it with the tolerant smile of a man who believed he was offering wisdom. "People begin to wonder." "What do they wonder?" she asked, because she genuinely wanted to know what he thought the answer was. He blinked, apparently not having expected the question. "Whether she is the marrying sort," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I am a schoolteacher, Mr. Marsh," she said. "My students have a geography examination next week, and I need to get home and prepare it. Good afternoon." She walked to the buggy and climbed up and drove out of town without looking back. But she was aware of Gerald Marsh standing on the boardwalk watching her go, and she was aware of the particular unpleasantness of being assessed and found lacking in a way she had not chosen and did not agree with. She had not cried about it. She had not cried about any of it, not the version of the conversation she had had with Gerald Marsh, not the version she had had with her aunt, not the version her mother had delivered at the train station in the form of a warning dressed up as love. But she drove the 6 miles back to the Double M in the afternoon light with her jaw set, and her hands steady on the reins, and something tight in the center of her chest that she recognized as the particular ache of being told, again, that who she was amounted to a problem. She was unhitching the horse from the buggy in the yard when Monroe came out of the barn and took the harness from her hands with a look at her face that said he saw something, though he did not ask about it immediately. He unhitched the horse with the practiced ease of a man who has done the same task 10,000 times and handed the animal off to Petey with a word, and then he came back to where she was standing by the buggy with her book under her arm and her shopping basket at her feet. "Gerald was in town," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. "Is it that obvious?" "You have a particular look," he said carefully, "when something has been said to you that you are deciding not to let touch you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He implied that being too independent would make people wonder if I was the marrying sort. Which I assume means he thinks it would make men less interested in marrying me, which he offered as a concern rather than an observation." Monroe was very still. "He said that to you?" "He said it with a smile," she said, "which I think he believed made it friendly advice." Monroe looked out across the yard toward the road to town with an expression that was entirely composed, but had something underneath it that she recognized after a moment as anger, the controlled kind, which she suspected was the only kind Monroe Ford ever permitted himself. "The thing is," she said, and she heard her own voice go a little tight in a way she immediately corrected, "it is not the first time I have been told that. At home my aunt told me I was too opinionated. My mother told me I was too independent. My father, who I believe loved me, told me I was too much of everything that was good in a man and not enough of everything that was supposed to be good in a woman. And now I have come all the way to Wyoming, and a man I have met 3 times tells me that being myself is going to make me unmarriageable," which she stopped. "I apologize. That is more than you asked for." "I asked," he said quietly. She looked at him. He had turned from looking at the road and was looking at her directly with those honest autumn water eyes, and she had the sudden clear sense that he was about to say something that mattered. "Everything they told you," he said, "every single version of that, they were wrong." She held his gaze. "You do not have to say that." "I am not saying it to be kind," he said. "I am saying it because it is the truth. I have been watching you for 6 weeks, Celia. You built a school. You learned 9 children in 4 hours. You adjusted your whole approach for 2 girls who needed something different without anyone asking you to. You drive yourself to town alone and read serious books, and you know when a horse is angry versus afraid from 20 feet away after 30 seconds of observation. You are the most genuinely capable person on this property, and I would include myself in that assessment, and I am considered reasonably capable by most accounts." The tightness in her chest had become something entirely different. She was looking at him, and he was looking at her, and she thought, with the clarity of a person who has not been paying attention to something and has suddenly begun paying attention, that she had been thinking about Monroe Ford a great deal more than she had acknowledged, and that standing in the yard in the late afternoon light with his words still in the air between them was one of the most real moments of her adult life. "They said I was too proud to make a good frontier wife," she said, which was almost word for word what Gerald Marsh had said, in the same tone his father used about her, and what she had understood her family to mean by all their gentler versions of the same message. Monroe Ford looked at her steadily for a long moment. "You are perfect," he said. She stared at him. He said it without decoration and without the performance of a man offering flattery. He said it the way he said everything, directly and with the particular conviction of a man who does not say things he does not mean, and she had enough experience of him by now to understand that this was not a small thing. He was not a man who used words carelessly. "Monroe," she said, and she heard something in her own voice that surprised her, a softness she was not entirely accustomed to. "I know it is not my place to say," he said carefully. "You have not asked for my opinion, and I am aware that having opinions about things without being asked for them is something people in your life have objected to, which means I am aware of the irony. But you asked, in a way, and I could not say something less than the truth." "I did not ask," she said slowly, "but I am glad you said it." They stood in the yard in the softening afternoon light, and the moment stretched between them with the particular quality of something new and important, and then Mrs. Aldridge appeared in the kitchen doorway and called that supper was 20 minutes off, and they both moved toward the house, and they did not say anything else about it that evening. But they sat at supper across from each other, and the space between them felt different, charged with something they had not yet named but both clearly felt. The naming happened by degrees, as things worth naming tend to do. Monroe began stopping at the schoolhouse at the end of her teaching days, not every day, but enough that it became a rhythm she found herself aware of. He would look at whatever she had been working on, or he would sit on the step outside while she finished something, and they would talk. They talked about the children. They talked about the ranch. They talked about the land and the weather and the particular challenges of building something real in a place that was still deciding what it wanted to be. They talked about books, because she had discovered that he read, quietly and seriously, whenever he had time, which was not often, and that he had a mind that engaged ideas with genuine interest, and then returned to the practical world without losing the thread of either. She found that she talked to him differently than she talked to anyone else. With most people she was measured, careful, aware of the edges of what was welcome. With Monroe she found herself saying the next thing that was actually true rather than the next thing that was safe, and discovering that the next true thing was received with attention rather than with the click of a tongue or the tolerant smile that meant she had gone too far. He was not a man who was easy with words. He was precise rather than fluent, and there were long silences in their conversations that she came to understand were not uncomfortable but were him thinking, genuinely thinking, before he spoke. She had known people who spoke before thinking and people who spoke instead of thinking, and she had very rarely known a person who thought with such evident seriousness, and then spoke from the conclusion of it. And she found this quality in him so genuinely restful that she sometimes caught herself simply sitting in the quiet with him and feeling, for the first time in her adult memory, completely at ease. By the beginning of July, she knew that she was in love with Monroe Ford. She did not arrive at this conclusion dramatically. She arrived at it the way she arrived at most conclusions, through the accumulation of evidence and the honest application of her own intelligence to what that evidence meant. And the evidence was that she thought about him when he was not present, that his opinion mattered to her more than anyone else's, that she was happiest in the hours they spent talking, and that when he had come into the schoolhouse one afternoon and she had looked up from her desk and seen the look on his face as he saw her, something in her had responded with a depth and a certainty that she recognized as something she had not felt before and did not expect to dismiss. What she did not know was whether he felt the same. She had the evidence of his words in the yard, which she had turned over many times. She had the evidence of his attention, which was consistent and particular. But Monroe Ford was a contained person, and she was not going to presume. The 4th of July came to Dusty Creek with the particular exuberance of a frontier town that took any occasion for a gathering as seriously as possible. There was a picnic on the grass behind the church, a shooting competition that drew men from 3 counties, a small amount of fireworks ordered from Denver at considerable expense and set off at dark, and a dance in the evening at the livery, which had been cleaned for the purpose with an enthusiasm that had left it smelling of fresh hay and cedar and the memory of horses. Celia wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that she had bought in Philadelphia before she left, and which her mother had approved of because the color was becoming and the cut was modest, and she had worn it precisely twice. She pinned her hair up more carefully than she usually bothered with and looked at herself in the small mirror in her room, and decided she looked like someone who was going to a dance and was not going to apologize for it. Monroe was waiting at the bottom of the porch steps in the late evening light, not as if he were waiting for her specifically, but in the careful way of a man who has positioned himself so that he is there when she arrives without being obvious about the intent. He was wearing a clean shirt that was so obviously not his usual working shirt that it made her want to smile. He had shaved. "You look nice," he said, which for Monroe was practically a speech. "You shaved," she said. He almost smiled. "Special occasion." They walked to town together in the cooling evening with the first stars coming out and the sounds of Dusty Creek's celebration already audible from 2 miles out, and they talked about the children's progress and the new homestead family that had arrived the previous week, and whether she thought she would have additional students in September. The conversation was ordinary and comfortable, and underneath, it was something neither of them was mentioning, which was that they were walking together in the dark with the stars coming out, and neither of them had suggested anything else. The dance was alive with fiddle music, and the particular joy of people who work very hard and do not often have the chance to stop. The livery had lanterns strung from the rafters that swung gently in the breeze from the open doors, and the floor had been swept clean and dusted with something that made it smooth for dancing, and the music was being produced by 4 musicians who clearly knew what they were doing. Celia danced with Thomas Harmon's father, who was surprisingly graceful, and with one of the ranch hands who was not, and with old Mr. Betts, Clara's grandfather, who told her that his granddaughter came home from school every day talking about Miss Sutton and that he was grateful she had come. She was standing at the edge of the floor with a cup of lemonade when Monroe appeared beside her and said quietly, "Would you dance with me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. They danced to a waltz, and Monroe was a better dancer than she had expected, not showy but steady and sure, and he held her with the careful consideration of a man who was very aware that he was holding someone important and did not want to make her feel otherwise. His hand at her waist was warm through the fabric of her dress, and she was close enough to him that she could feel the particular solidity of his presence, that quality of stillness he carried that was not distance but groundedness, as if he were rooted somewhere real and calm and she could feel the ground through him. "You said I was perfect," she said, quietly enough that it was for him alone. He looked down at her. The lantern light moved across his face. "I remember. Did you mean it?" "Yes," he said simply. "Because," she said, and she kept her voice level with the effort of someone who is being honest, because she has decided that honesty is worth the exposure of it. "I have been thinking about why it mattered so much. What you said. And I think it is because most people's version of a compliment is that I am good despite something. Despite being too opinionated or too independent or too capable. And you said it without an exception. As if the things other people call flaws are simply parts of me that you see without the frame of a problem." Monroe was quiet for the length of 3 steps of the waltz. Then he said, "I have been trying to find the right time to tell you something." Her heart did something she was not going to catalog in detail. "All right," she said. "I am not a man who is good at saying things," he said. "I am better at doing things, but I want to say this because you deserve to hear it said clearly." He looked at her steadily, this man who did nothing carelessly. "I love you, Celia. I have loved you since about the 2nd week you were here, which I recognize is a fairly short time. But I have learned to trust my own assessments of situations, and my assessment of this one is that it is not going to change. I am not asking for anything. I know you have a life you are building and I would not put pressure on that, but I thought you should know." The fiddle played on around them. The lantern swung. She looked at Monroe Ford and thought about all the things she had been told she was, too much and not enough and too proud and too independent, and she thought about the way he looked at her, which was not the way of a man who found her too much of anything. "I love you too," she said. He looked at her for a moment as if he were reading the words to make sure they were what they appeared to be. And then the almost smile became something fuller and more real than she had ever seen on his face, something warm and entirely unguarded. And she thought that she had been right to come west and right to build her school and right to say the true thing rather than the safe thing. Because here was a man who loved her for all the right reasons, and she was not going to talk herself out of it. They danced the rest of the waltz, and then they went outside into the cool July night and stood under the vast Wyoming stars and talked for a very long time about things both small and large. And when he walked her back to the Double M in the dark, he held her hand and neither of them said anything about the fact of it, which did not need to be said. The summer deepened, and so did everything between them. They spent evenings on the porch after supper, talking or not talking as the mood required. He began showing her things he knew about the land, not in the manner of a teacher demonstrating expertise, but in the manner of someone sharing something loved, pointing out the tracks that meant deer versus elk, showing her where the creek ran coldest and where the spring wildflowers came in earliest, letting her sit on his horse, a big bay named Copper, while he walked beside her one afternoon when she expressed that she wished she rode better than she did. She taught him things too. She showed him the patterns in the way the children learned and talked about why different methods worked for different minds, and she gave him George Eliot to read, which he returned 3 weeks later with specific observations about the character of Dorothea that made her sit back in her chair and look at him with fresh appreciation. Most men would not read a book about a woman's interior life, she said. Most men, he said equably, are missing out. She laughed, the too loud laugh she had never corrected because she had decided it was hers, and Monroe looked at her with the expression that had become her favorite expression of his, the one where he was simply glad she was there. She also began to understand over that summer more about who Monroe Ford was and where he had come from. He had grown up the son of a Texas cattle rancher, the youngest of 4 boys, in a family that was not unkind but was entirely practical, where love was expressed through work done and not through words offered. His mother had died when he was 10. His father had remarried a woman who was decent but distant. His brothers had scattered to various enterprises across the Southwest. Monroe had gone north with the cattle drives because the land had called to him the way certain things call to certain people without being able to explain themselves, and he had followed it the way a sensible man follows a true thing. He had never expected to fall in love with someone like Celia Sutton, which he told her one evening in late August when they were sitting on the fence watching the sunset paint the mountains in colors that had no adequate names. "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it. "Someone quieter," he said. "I think I had the idea that a woman who suited me would be simpler, less demanding of my attention in the good way." He looked at her. "I was wrong about that. I am demanding," she agreed cheerfully. "In the best possible way," he said. "You make me think. You make me look at things differently. I did not know I wanted that until I had it." She leaned her shoulder against his. "I did not know I wanted someone who would simply let me be what I am," she said. "I thought I had made my peace with the fact that people were always going to find me too much, and then you said I was perfect and it reordered something." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the mountains turned from pink to purple in the last light, and it was one of the most complete moments of her life. Gerald Marsh became a complication in September, when he made his interest in Celia more explicit and less polite. He cornered her after church one Sunday in Dusty Creek, the same tolerance mile approach as before, but with a more direct intent beneath it this time, suggesting that she might find things considerably more comfortable on the double M if she were inclined to be friendly toward him. She had looked at him with the directness she had long since stopped apologizing for and said, "Mr. Marsh, I think you should know that I am not available in the way you mean, and I would appreciate it if you would not approach me this way again." Gerald's smile had hardened around the edges. "Available to who?" he asked, and his glance had gone meaningfully toward the other side of the churchyard where Monroe was standing talking to Thomas Harmon's father. "That is not a question I am going to answer," she said, "because it is not relevant to the answer I have already given you," and she had walked away. Monroe had seen the exchange from across the yard, and when he came to her side his face was carefully arranged but his eyes were not. "Gerald," he said. He was not threatening, she said. "Just unpleasant." "I will speak to him," Monroe said. "You do not need to fight my battles," she said. "I handled it." "I know you handled it," Monroe said. "I am going to speak to him because he is a grown man who ought to know better and apparently does not, and someone who is not you should tell him so." He looked at her steadily. "I am not doing it because you cannot. I am doing it because he should hear it from someone who will make him understand the extent of the problem with his behavior." She thought about this. The distinction he was drawing was real and important. The difference between stepping in because you believe someone is weak and stepping in because you believe something is wrong and you have the standing to address it. "All right," she said. She did not ask what he said to Gerald Marsh. She did not need to. Gerald Marsh avoided her with a new and thoroughgoing purpose after that day, which was all she had wanted. Eldon Marsh himself was a more complicated matter. He was not hostile to Celia, but he was not entirely comfortable with her either, and she understood why. She did not fit the model of womanhood he had built his expectations around, and she further complicated his household by being in a relationship with his foreman that was obviously serious and that he had not sanctioned or anticipated. He brought it up in the direct manner of a man who preferred things on the table. "Ford tells me you two are walking out," he said one evening at supper in early October. He said it to Monroe rather than to Celia, which was itself an illustration of his worldview. "We are," Monroe said. Eldon looked at Celia. "You are aware that marrying a foreman is a considerable step down from what a woman of your education might expect." Celia set down her fork. She had been waiting for a version of this conversation. "Mr. Marsh," she said pleasantly, "Monroe Ford is the most intelligent, capable, and honest man I have encountered in my life. I would not describe being with him as a step in any direction, except towards something very good. I understand that you have a particular view of what a woman of my education should expect, and I appreciate that you offered it, but I am entirely capable of forming my own view." Eldon Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Monroe. Then he looked back at his plate. "I suppose you are," he said, with the particular tone of a man who has been answered in a way he did not anticipate but cannot actually dispute. Monroe caught her eye across the table. His mouth did the not quite smile. She looked back at her plate. Mrs. Aldridge, who had been in the kitchen during the exchange, appeared with the bread basket at that precise moment and set it on the table with an expression of serene innocence that said she had heard every word and was very pleased with the outcome. The autumn was golden and clear and full, and the school grew. 3 new students enrolled in September, bringing the count to 12, and by October Celia had written to the Wyoming Territorial Board of Education requesting formal recognition of the Dusty Creek Settlement School and a small grant for additional books and materials. The response came in November and confirmed both the recognition and the grant, and she read the letter twice standing in the cold morning air of the yard before going to find Monroe. He was in the barn with Copper, and she came in without announcement and said, "The Territory has recognized the school." He put down what he was doing and turned and looked at her face, and then he crossed the space between them in 3 steps and lifted her off the ground in a brief, complete embrace, which was so unlike his usual careful restraint that she laughed the too loud laugh right in his ear. And she felt him laugh too, his whole chest with it, which was a sound she realized she had never heard from him before, and which she immediately wanted to hear many more times. He set her down and looked at her with the fully unguarded expression that was her favorite, the one that had no reserve in it at all. "You did that," he said. "The school did that," she said. "Celia, the children," she said firmly. "You," he said, with a finality that was not worth arguing with. He proposed to her on the first day of December, which was cold and brilliant, and had left a thin skin of ice on the water barrel in the yard. He had told her the evening before that he wanted to show her something, and she had come out in the morning in her coat and her good boots to find that he had brought Copper around and was waiting with an ease that suggested he had been there for some time. They rode out, she on Copper and Monroe on a sturdy gray he had borrowed from the stock, to a piece of land about a mile west of the Double M's main property, on a rise that looked out over the valley with the mountains beyond it, and the morning light was so extraordinary across the snow-dusted grass that she stopped Copper and just sat for a moment. "I have been looking at this piece of land," Monroe said beside her. "It is a quarter section. The homestead claim is available. A man could file on it." She looked at him. He was looking at the land, measuring it with his eyes in the way he measured things, carefully and completely. "Monroe," she said. He looked at her. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a modest one, a thin gold band with a small dark stone that was either garnet or dark ruby. It was hard to tell in the winter light, but it was beautiful in the way of something chosen with real consideration. "I would like to build something here," he said. "A house, a small operation, something of our own. I have savings enough to start. I would like to build it with you if you will have me." He held the ring in his ungloved hand. "I know you have your school and your own work, and I am not asking you to give any of it up. I am asking you to add this to it if you want to." She looked at the ring and at his face, and at the land beneath the winter sky, and she thought about all the people who had said that who she was made her unsuitable for this, unsuitable for a good life and a good love, too proud and too independent and too much of everything that was supposed to be the wrong kind of thing. She looked at Monroe Ford, who had looked at every one of those things and said, "You are perfect." "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger with hands that were not entirely steady, which was the most human thing she had ever seen from him, and which she loved completely. She leaned across from her horse, and he leaned across from his, and they kissed, with the mountains behind them and the vast Wyoming sky above them, and the horses stood politely in the cold morning air, as if they understood the occasion. They were married in March of 1883, in the little white church at the end of Dusty Creek's Main Street, on a morning that was sharp and bright and smelled of the spring that was just beginning to make its case against the last of the winter. Mrs. Aldridge cried. Petey, now 15, stood straighter than Celia had ever seen him stand. Thomas Harmon sat in the second pew with his family and wore an expression of dignified approval that made her want to laugh during the ceremony, which she managed barely to suppress. Eldon Marsh came. He shook Monroe's hand, and then, after a moment's visible deliberation, he turned to Celia and said, "You have been good for this place, Miss Sutton." He paused. "Mrs. Ford." "Thank you, Mr. Marsh," she said, and she meant it genuinely. Monroe had filed on the homestead claim in February, and they spent the spring and summer building on it. He did not leave his position with the double M immediately, because he had given his word to Marsh for the season, and his word was a serious thing. But he worked evenings and his days off on the house, and Celia worked beside him with the systematic energy that had always characterized her engagement with anything she cared about. She had never built a house before. She found that she was good at it, which surprised no one who knew her well. The Harmon boys helped on Saturdays in exchange for tutoring during the week, a trade that had been Thomas's suggestion, offered with the careful casualness of a boy who did not want to appear to be asking a favor. She had been so pleased by his initiative that she had agreed without bargaining. Monroe had listened to her describe this transaction one evening and said, with the level appreciation of a man who recognized quality thinking in its natural habitat, "You have done something very good with that boy." "He did it himself," she said. "I just gave him the room." "That is exactly what I mean," Monroe said. They moved into the house in September of 1883. It was not large, 3 rooms plus a lean-to kitchen that they planned to expand in the spring, but it was solid and well situated, and it was theirs. And she stood in the doorway on the first morning and looked out at the land and the mountains, and felt the particular weight and fullness of a life that was genuinely her own. Monroe had left the double M in August on good terms, with Eldon Marsh's somewhat grudging acknowledgment that he was losing a fine foreman, and his somewhat less grudging acknowledgment that Monroe had the right to his own enterprise. Monroe had 3 good horses and 20 head of cattle to start with, purchased with the savings he had accumulated over years of careful living, and a clear-eyed plan for building a horse breeding operation on the quality of what he had watched Eldon Marsh begin and believed he could do better. Celia kept the school. There had never been any question of that. She rode to it each morning on a small mare Monroe had helped her select, a brown and white paint named Josephine, who was steady and sensible and suited her perfectly. And she came home in the afternoons to a house that was becoming, by increments, everything she had not known she was building toward. They argued sometimes, which she felt was important to note, because people who pretended marriage had no disagreement in it were not telling the truth about marriage. She was opinionated and he was stubborn, and there were evenings when these qualities produced friction that required both of them to do the work of listening rather than simply waiting to respond. But the arguments were honest and always resolved, because they were both, at their core, people who valued the truth more than the comfort of being right, and that made a very significant difference. In the winter of 1883, when the cold came down hard off the mountains and the days shortened to something almost austere, Celia sat at the kitchen table one evening doing her lesson planning, and Monroe sat across from her reading. And the fire in the hearth was good, and the lantern light was warm, and she looked at him over the top of her papers and thought that this was what she had always wanted without having had the language for it, not to be quieter or smaller or less, but to be exactly what she was in a life built exactly to that size. Monroe looked up from his book as if he had felt the quality of her attention. He looked at her across the table. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I am just glad." He looked at her for a moment with the fully open expression, the best one. "So am I," he said. She went back to her papers. He went back to his book. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie in the dark, and the house held against it, and that was enough. Spring came to the valley in 1884 with a thoroughness that felt like an argument being made, wildflowers erupting across the hillsides in colors that had no reason to be that vivid and were vivid anyway. Celia discovered in April that she was expecting, which she received with the calm practicality of a person who had made a decision and was ready for its consequences, and also with a private joy so large she had to walk outside in the early morning and stand in the grass for a few minutes to let it settle. She told Monroe over breakfast. She said it directly, as she said everything, and watched his face do something she had not seen before, a kind of quiet, complete overwhelm, as if a thing he had not admitted to wanting very deeply had just been given to him without warning. He got up from the table and came around to her and knelt on one knee beside her chair, which was not a gesture she had expected from Monroe Ford, who was not given to theatrical gestures, and he took both her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling very well," she said, with the warmth of someone who recognizes that being asked if you are well is a man's way of saying something he cannot yet find the words for. "Good," he said. "That is," he stopped. "Tried again." "I am going to be," he stopped again. He looked at their joined hands. "I could not have imagined," he finally said, which was incomplete as a sentence but complete as a statement. "I know," she said. She touched his face. "Neither could I." The baby came in November of 1884, in the middle of a snowstorm that the midwife, a capable and entirely unflappable woman named Mrs. Purcell from Dusty Creek, navigated with the ease of someone who had done this many times in worse conditions. It was a boy. He came into the world loud and certain about it, which Monroe said, with a half-smile that had become something much more open over the years of their marriage, was probably hereditary. They named him James, for no particular family reason, but because it was a good solid name that suited him. And from his first hours in the world, he was a person of very definite opinions, which Celia found entirely endearing and also familiar. Monroe held his son that first evening with the concentrated care of a man holding something irreplaceable, and Celia, exhausted and warm and more content than she had words for, watched him from the bed and thought that she had made exactly the right choices, all of them, including the one to get on the train and come west and refuse to be quiet about who she was. The school in Dusty Creek had, by 1885, grown to 22 students, which was more than Celia could efficiently manage alone. She wrote to the territorial board again and applied for funding for an assistant teacher, making her case in the direct and well-documented manner she had learned produced results from institutions that were otherwise inclined to defer indefinitely. The funding was approved in the spring, and she hired a young woman named Rosa Reyes, Sofiana and Maria's older sister, who had educated herself through every book Celia had provided to the family, and who turned out to be a natural teacher with a particular gift for the younger children. The day Rosa walked into the schoolroom as a teacher rather than a student was one of the days Celia noted in her journal as one that had turned out exactly right. Monroe's horse breeding operation had by 1885 become something genuinely worth talking about in the county. He had an eye for the animals that was the kind of gift you could not entirely account for, an instinct built from years of careful attention and genuine love for the work, and the horses he produced were becoming known across the territory for their quality. He had taken on 2 hands of his own, by the spring, young men he trained with the same patient firmness he had always brought to his work, and the small operation was profitable enough to expand, which they discussed at the kitchen table over the winter of 1884, with the careful deliberation of people who took the business of their life seriously. Celia turned 27 in the March of 1885 with a party that she had not asked for, and that Monroe had arranged in consultation with Mrs. Aldridge, who still came to the Ford homestead regularly, and had adopted a role in their household that was approximately grandmother without the official designation, and which suited everyone. The party was small, the Harmon family and the Aldridges and Petey, who was now 17 and had grown into a young man with his gap-toothed grin, and a genuine talent for horses that Monroe was beginning to properly develop. Thomas Harmon, who was 15 and had that year begun a correspondence with the University of Wyoming regarding their preparatory program, brought her a book he had selected himself, a scientific text on geology that he said he thought she would find interesting because it was about how things got to be the way they were through a long series of events that made sense when you understood the pattern. She read the inscription he had written in the front, which said simply, "From your most difficult student, who is grateful," and she looked at him across the table and thought that she had been right about him from the first day, that he was brilliant, and that the frustration had been the friction of a mind looking for something big enough to engage it. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. He looked at the table. "You made me better at things," he said, in the manner of a 15-year-old boy offering the most significant compliment in his emotional vocabulary, and hoping no one was going to make a production of it. She did not make a production of it. She simply nodded and said, "You did that yourself," and he looked back up with the expression of someone who has been understood in exactly the right way. The summer of 1885 brought trouble of the kind that the territory was still prone to. A dispute over grazing land between a new homesteader named Prout and one of the older ranching families that escalated from words to property damage, to a confrontation that left Prout's barn burned, and 2 men from the area under sheriff's investigation. The sheriff, a man named Calhoun who was reasonably honest and entirely overwhelmed, came to Monroe for his thoughts on the situation because Monroe was known as a man whose judgment could be trusted. Monroe spent several evenings in conversation about it, once with Eldon Marsh, once with 3 of the homesteading families who were anxious about whether the violence would spread, and once with the sheriff himself at the Ford kitchen table while Celia nursed James in the next room, and listened to the conversation through the wall with the close attention she gave to anything important. After the sheriff left, she came into the kitchen and sat across from Monroe and said, "The problem is that the grazing land dispute is legitimate on both sides and nobody has established clear legal precedent for this section of the territory." Monroe looked at her. "I know. The sheriff needs to get the land agent involved before the winter," she said, "and both families need to agree to a mediated conversation before anyone else tries to resolve it physically." Monroe was looking at her with the particular quality of attention that meant he was taking in information that was useful to him. "Can you write that down?" he said. "The argument for mediation. Clearly. I am going to bring it to the sheriff and to Marsh, and if it is in writing it carries more weight. Of course I can write it down, she said. I know, he said. I mean, will you? Yes, she said. She paused. Monroe, yes, you could have worked this out without me. I could have worked out the broad strokes, he said. You saw the legal piece I had not thought through. I would rather have the full picture. She wrote the argument for mediation and Monroe presented it to the relevant parties, and the land agent came out from Cheyenne in October, and the dispute was eventually resolved through a negotiated boundary that neither party entirely loved and both parties accepted, which was, as Celia noted, usually how real resolutions worked. James Ford turned 1 year old in November of 1885 and had opinions about his birthday cake that he expressed with energy and specificity, which made Monroe laugh the full laugh that Celia still loved to hear, and which made Mrs. Aldrich declare that he was exactly his mother in miniature, which Celia received as the highest possible compliment. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was hard, one of the hard ones that the territory produced with a regularity that reminded everyone that the land was not tamed, only negotiated with, and that the negotiation was ongoing. The cold came early and stayed, and there were 2 weeks in January when the temperature dropped so low that Monroe would not let Celia make the ride to school, and she taught from the kitchen table instead, which produced an impromptu arrangement by which she sent lessons home with the Harmon boys, who were close enough to ride even in the cold, and they distributed them to the other families on their route. And she graded the returned work at the same kitchen table, while James slept, and Monroe worked by the fire mending tack with the quiet, careful focus he brought to all physical tasks. It was in those winter evenings that she wrote the first of what would eventually become a series of essays about frontier education, about what she had learned in 3 years of teaching in Dusty Creek about how children in new settlements learned, what they needed that was different from the established Eastern model, how the particular conditions of frontier life shaped the mind, and what a teacher could do to work with those shapes rather than against them. She did not write them with any particular plan for publication. She wrote them because she was a person who understood things by writing them down, and the understanding accumulated over 3 years of teaching was worth setting down. Monroe read the first essay on a February evening and put it down on the table and looked at her and said, "You need to send this somewhere." "It is just my observations," she said. "It is better than that," he said. "Monroe, you need to send it somewhere," he said, with the quiet finality she recognized as the tone that meant he was right, and they both knew it, and arguing was possible but not going to change the outcome. She sent the first essay to the Wyoming Territorial Education Review in March of 1886, along with a brief letter explaining its context. It was published in May. The response was modest. A letter from a teacher in Laramie who said it had been exactly what she needed, a note from the territorial board that they had found it useful, and one letter from a woman in Cheyenne who ran a school for children of Chinese immigrant workers, and who said that the essay had articulated something she had been struggling to put into words for years. Celia kept all 3 letters in the desk drawer of the schoolhouse. She read them when the work felt hard, which was not often because the work rarely felt like only work, but occasionally, and they reminded her that what she was doing had an existence beyond the room it happened in. She discovered she was expecting their second child in the summer of 1886, which she received with even more equanimity than the first time, because the first time had taught her what to expect from her own body and also from Monroe, who had spent James's entire first year in a state of devoted vigilance that had been both touching and occasionally requiring gentle management. "You do not have to check on me every 2 hours," she had told him when James was 4 months old. "I know," he had said, and had continued doing it. With the second pregnancy, he was still attentive but had calibrated himself somewhat, and she appreciated the calibration without finding the attention less meaningful. He brought her ginger tea in the mornings when the sickness was bad in the early months, without fanfare, simply set it beside her on the desk and did not comment on it. He took on the morning ride to the school to drop off her materials so she did not have to manage the mount before the sickness passed. He read to James every evening so that she could have an hour of quiet, which she used sometimes to write and sometimes simply to sit and feel the child moving in her, which was its own kind of extraordinary thing. The second baby was born in February of 1887, another hard winter delivery attended by Mrs. Purcell, who arrived through 6 inches of fresh snow with the same unflappable competence as before. This time it was a girl, who came into the world with her father's quietness rather than her brother's volume, looking around with dark, alert eyes as if she were already assessing the situation. They named her Eliza. Monroe held her in the same concentrated way he had held James, but with a different quality to it, something that recognized the particular gift of a daughter. And Celia watched him and thought that she was going to be a girl who had a father who showed her, every day of her life, that what she was did not need to be apologized for. James, who was 2, looked at his sister with the cautious interest of a small person encountering an unknown variable. He touched her hand with one finger and she closed her fist around it with the grip that newborns had, that surprisingly powerful grip, and he looked at the joined hands and then up at Celia with an expression of absolute seriousness, as if he were marking the moment as significant. "Yes," she told him, "that is your sister." He considered this. "Mine," he said. "Yours," she confirmed. He appeared satisfied with this arrangement. Dusty Creek in 1887 was a different town than it had been in 1882, larger and more established, with a proper bank and a doctor who had come to stay, and a second church, and 3 times as many families on the surrounding land. The school had grown to 30 students, and Rosa had taken on a second assistant, a young man from one of the homesteading families who had proven himself academically sharp and temperamentally suited to the work. Celia had become, without entirely meaning to, the most educationally significant figure in the county, which was not a title she had sought but which she found she wore without discomfort. The territorial board had written twice asking her to consider serving on an advisory committee for frontier school policy. She had agreed to the second request, which meant a trip to Cheyenne in the spring of 1887 that Monroe accompanied her on, leaving James with Mrs. Aldridge and bringing Eliza, who was old enough to travel and young enough to sleep through most of it. The committee meeting was held in the territorial capital in a room that smelled of new wood and ambition, and contained 12 people, only 2 of whom were women, and which began with the kind of formal circumlocution that large institutions favored, and which Celia moved through with patient competence, until the moment when the discussion turned to the question of curriculum standards for settlement schools. At which point, she offered 4 specific and well-documented observations that she had come to give, and which she gave without apology, and without the softening preamble that women were often expected to offer before saying anything direct. The chairman of the committee, a man named Alderton, looked at her for a moment after she finished and then said, "That is an excellent framework, Mrs. Ford. Would you be willing to put it in writing for the committee's formal record?" "I already have," she said, and handed him the document she had prepared, which he received with an expression that suggested he had not expected her to be this prepared, which was the expression she most often produced in rooms like this one, and which she had learned to find wryly amusing rather than frustrating. Monroe was waiting for her in the anteroom with Eliza asleep against his shoulder, and he looked at her face when she came out and said, "How did it go?" "Extremely well," she said. "The chairman wants my framework in writing." "He has it," Monroe said, because he knew her. "He does," she said. Monroe looked at her with the full open expression, the best one, the one that had no reserve in it at all. "Of course he does," he said. They walked out of the territorial capital building into the spring Cheyenne afternoon, Monroe with the sleeping Eliza still against his shoulder, and Celia beside him in the clear western light, And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Dusty Creek 5 years ago with 2 trunks and a teaching certificate, and the conviction that who she was amounted to something worth building on. She had been told she was too proud to make a good frontier wife. She had been told she was too much, too independent, too capable, too opinionated, too whatever the word was that covered the sin of being exactly what you were without apology. Monroe Ford had looked at all of it and said she was perfect. She thought about that, walking in the spring light beside the man who had meant it, the man who had built a house and a life with her, and read the books she gave him, and raised their children with the steady tenderness of a person who understood that love was a daily practice rather than a single declaration. She thought about the school and the students and the essays and the committee and the particular satisfaction of a life that was entirely, genuinely hers, not despite who she was but because of it. She reached over and took Monroe's free hand. He squeezed it without looking, because it was the kind of gesture that did not require ceremony between them, just acknowledgement, just the simple daily fact of choosing each other. Eliza stirred against his shoulder and made a small sound without waking, and Monroe tilted his head to look at her face and then looked forward again, and the afternoon light lay across the street in the long, gold way of Wyoming spring, and Dusty Creek was 6 miles in the other direction, and the school and the horses and the house on the rise with the mountains behind it were all there, waiting, the way real things wait, without urgency, without doubt, simply present and continuing. James was with Mrs. Aldridge and had probably already convinced Petey to let him brush copper, because he had inherited his mother's persuasive competence and his father's love of horses in equal measure, and applied them together in ways that were technically outside the rules but logically difficult to argue with. Thomas Harmon had received his acceptance to the university's preparatory program the previous month, and had come to the schoolhouse to tell her before he told his family, which was a thing she had not expected, and which had required her to excuse herself for a moment to compose herself before she could respond properly. Rosa was planning to take the assistant teacher examination in the fall, which she was going to pass, because she was thorough and prepared and loved the work. The land was big and the sky was bigger, and the life she had built in it was exactly the right size for everything she was and everything she was still becoming, and Monroe was beside her, and the children were theirs, and the mountains were waiting at the horizon the way they always were, ancient and unbothered and endlessly, genuinely beautiful. She was not too much. She had never been too much. She was exactly right. She was exactly, completely, perfectly right. And she knew it now in the deepest way a person could know a thing, not as an argument she was making against the people who had told her otherwise, but as a simple truth she had found in the middle of her real life, in the schoolroom and the yard and the kitchen and the evenings by the fire and the mornings on the rise looking at the mountains. In every moment of this wide, serious, luminous life she had chosen and built and loved. Monroe Ford had said it to her in a barnyard in the late afternoon light in the spring of 1882, with the particular certainty of a man who only said things he meant. "You are perfect." She had known from the moment he said it that he was right. She had spent every day since proving it.